thank you for that lovely introduction. I think I jumped the gun and came on stage well before I was supposed to, so we're sitting here patiently while the quotes are up. It's great to see so many people in the room. It's really busy today. I said to someone, it feels like being at a wedding, because there's so many people I haven't seen since last year, so you're going around the room saying hello to everyone, but also so many new faces as well, and welcome to you if this is your first time at the conference. I'm really excited about the panel today. We're going to be talking about greenwashing. Overcoming greenwashing in investment management. And this is a question time panel, so it means it's not all on us. You guys have homework, so pens out, paper out. We're going to be coming to you after our first round of questions. So I want you thinking about the kinds of questions that you want to ask the panelists. And if you can't think of any, then I'll just have to ask all the questions, which is totally fine by me, but you should probably try and get in there as well. So first of all, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, and then we're going to ask everybody their question to start. But first of all, let's go on to introductions, and I've got my piece of paper in the wrong order, so here we go. So first of all, we have Sonali, who leads Simmons & Simmons advisory offering on environmental, social and governance matters and has significant experience across the legal and policy landscape, which is increasingly important in greenwashing. Next, we have Amanda, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at abrdn, and she has over 2 decades of experience in responsible investment and has been listed as an influencer in this space for a number of years. Next, we have David, who has worked... Oh, I've lost my bit. Next, we have David, who has over 35 years experience in the investment industry, doesn't look like it. And he is head of stewardship, sustainability and impact. And last but not least, we have Yulia, who's joining us from the Principles of Responsible Investment. I'd like you to give a big warm welcome to our panelists while I get my questions in order and think about your questions. Okay, we're going to start with the easy question first. So we're going to start with Sonali, and we're going to talk about legal and regulatory issues. Now, if you've been working in this greenwashing space, you'll know that there is an ongoing onslaught of regulation for asset managers and across the financial services sector. So, Sonali, a question for you. From a legal perspective, people are facing into this regulatory change, some of them dealing with it well, some of them dealing with it not so well. How damaging is this issue of greenwashing to the players in the finance sector?
Sure. Thank you, Casey, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here and see you all. Yeah, the lawyer in the room is always not the most popular, so starting with me, not impacted by that, I hope. Look, unfortunately, the reality is greenwashing and the litigation that accompanies it is in fact having quite a damaging impact. There is, I mean, you can look at for every cloud, you know, there is some positivity to it, and hopefully we can come to that later on in the conversation. But the fact remains that it does impact market values. So the Grantham Institute, if you're not aware of it, they publish a fantastic report on an annual basis on litigation trends. And they recently did a market study in terms of the impact greenwashing and litigation in particular has on market perception and value for corporates. And they came up with some data to suggest on average it's 0.41% for corporates, reducing the market expectation in terms of valuations. And for carbon majors, or certainly for oil and gas, it's 1.5%. So the reality is it does impact perception. Now, whether or not that would increase, look, there's a crystal ball. Looking at the trends from a regulatory, from a legal standpoint, I suspect it will get bigger in volume before it abates, not least because we have some very strong headwinds on the regulatory side. There's not much convergence. I'm sure my fellow panelists have felt the pain over the past 24 months or so at least. And there's pockets of group therapy that happens within the industry as we try and cope with this. But that trend, if you will, is likely to increase before it calms down, not least given that the topic is hugely politicized now. We are in the midst of election cycles, so in these circumstances, it does have an impact.
Thank you so much. So kick-starting the discussion there. I'm going to head to David. So David works with Martin Currie, which is part of the Franklin Templeton group, and you operate in the US. And with the election cycles coming through, how are you navigating as an organization that spans both Europe and the US these choppy political waters?
Okay, well, I think if we stand back for a moment and just think about the politicization, I think what's been driving that. I think part of it is around how ESG is defined. So it's very broadly and personally, I think very vaguely defined. I have to admit, I don't really understand the term ESG investing. I think, as Alex said earlier on, it's really about investing. So it's thinking about kind of what's the factors that influence the ability of a company to generate long-term returns. So it's really about long-term investing. I think if you look at a lot of the anti-ESG legislation, it's kind of really focused on the why. So why, what are the motivations for people considering ESG, etc. And I think as an asset manager, it's really important to frame what you do in terms of fiduciary duty, how are you acting as fiduciaries for your clients, and then being very clear about what you do. So why do you do what you do in terms of fiduciaries, and then being very clear about how do you do that. And so the focus really is as an industry is on authenticity, and clearly greenwashing is trying to kind of look through and identifying whether that's the case. And really, in terms of how do you navigate the current ebbs and flows that we're seeing, it's really that focus on authenticity and being very clear about what you do.
Thank you. So I'm going to come to Amanda, but I've got a data point for you, and I just want to probe whether you think this is correct or not. So the Responsible Investment Australia Association, or Responsible Investment Association of Australia, I don't know which way around the A's go, has just released their report on the amount of money that's managed responsibly, and they've said it's gone down. Now, I kind of wonder whether that's true. Like, has the amount of money that is being managed responsibly gone down, or has the amount of money that is saying that it is responsibly managed gone down to this point on authenticity and disclosure? Are we really seeing declines, or are people starting to get a little bit scared about greenwashing and instead kind of being quiet? What's your thoughts on this topic of green hushing?
Yes, so everybody talks about greenwashing, but nobody really has thought about green hushing, and I think that's as harmful to the industry as greenwashing is. And to David's point, being authentic is absolutely key when you're thinking about sustainable investing and sustainability factors within a mainstream investment portfolio. I think there is a real fear at the moment of people. A lot of people jumped on the bandwagon, sustainable investing. I've been in this industry for nearly 25 years. It took a long time to get people to understand financial materiality. And there is a point at which we need to come back to those first principles, which I'll touch on in a second. But everybody is now frightened of saying anything about anything. An example is we are currently doing the PRI survey. We've submitted our answers. This year, for the first time, we had to put all of that through our compliance department because everybody is concerned about putting something in the public domain which they will then potentially be held accountable for legally. Now, whilst I absolutely support the fact that we need to be honest and transparent, there is a real risk that that will actually harm the industry and that we will go backwards. To David's point, why is this important? Come back to first principles. We are here to manage people's long-term savings. If we don't have a world to retire to in 30 years' time, our industry is pointless. People need to have a world to live in and an income to live off. And that goes hand in hand with risk. So if we are investing in industries or companies or investments that are affected by climate change, inequalities, biodiversity loss, this all has a material impact on the companies we're investing in and their long-term ability to generate the returns we need to pay our customers their savings and their pensions.
Thank you, Amanda. Really interesting point there coming up. So thinking about this concept of double materiality, right? So making money, but also thinking about this creative force of capital. What kind of world is it creating? What kind of world are we going to retire into? I have an intern working for me, and they were reading some definitions. They were like, oh, so hang on. Do you mean like in the finance world, you only care if something like impacts the financial value? What about what you're doing to the world? And I want to come on to you, Yulia, because I think the principles of responsible investment as a kind of organization that takes care of this definition of responsible investment that's been gathering data, gathering signatories, is starting to wrestle with definitions and starting to wrestle with a kind of maturity around what does it mean to be a responsible investor during this period of really crisis, and how do we recognize that capital is really creative or potentially destructive to this future that we're going to live in. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit around how is the PRI thinking about this? You've had a consultation out recently on what it means to be a responsible investor. Where do we think the PRI will go, noting that there is a big conference for those of you who are attending, so this may be an area of discussion at the conference later this year.
Yes, sure. Thank you. So maybe just to take a little bit of a step back, when PRI was set up back in 2006, we really talked about responsible investment from the angle of ESG materiality and assessing ESG materiality of investment assets. As the time went on and the industry evolved, investors also started to incorporate this idea of negative and positive or positive impacts of their own actions and their own investments on the broader society, on environment, climate. So obviously what it does, it now brings a lot more complexity into the definitions, the clarity of what actually means. Casey, to your point, we've just earlier this year done a consultation with our signatories globally, and we revealed the results that responsible investment varies, interpretation of responsible investment varies for all of our investors, and it can vary based on their geographical location. It can also vary based on their individual mandates. And whilst for all responsible investment, managing ESG risk is of course key and important. For some, we're seeing the shift that they're starting to align their portfolios with sustainability outcomes, and they feel that this is best fulfills their fiduciary duty. And then the others really starting to seek and act on investment impact, or sometimes the industry refers to as the sustainability outcomes. So where does it actually take us to? And I agree with Amanda's point that and with my long experience with the PRI, I've definitely seen this shift in investors, how they talk about responsible investment practices. So they do annual reporting back to us, and we've noticed that recently they started to really scrutinize the terminology, the language. They're becoming a lot more careful about what they're putting out in the public domain, because they want to possibly avoid the public scrutiny. And that's understandable in light of the anti-ESG trust. But I also want to come back to this question, what the investors actually doing about it. And I think we can probably bring up two elements of what we see, how investors combat greenwashing is through active participation in collaborative engagements or initiatives where they work together with other investors, industry associations, stakeholders, to actually develop that common understanding of what responsible investment is, of the definitions, because this is key to at least unintentional greenwashing. And one example of that initiative is UN Net Zero Asset Managers, where investors are committed to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets in line with TCFD. So there is a common threshold that all of them are working with. Another example is Climate Action 100+, where the Net Zero Company Benchmark provides a useful tool or a framework, common framework, to assess the company's ambitions around their greenhouse ambitions. And then I think lastly is also engaging with policymakers and standard setters, because they do have a role to play to combat greenwashing. And investors do this independently. They do this via PRI or other industry associations. And I really would like to thank those active investors who dedicate their time to support this work of the PRI. And maybe just the last note, and this is fresh off the press, we've just published this week a statement which was co-designed with the PRI, the UN Sustainable Exchanges Initiative, and the London Stock Exchange Group, which is calling on jurisdictions around the world to adopt ISSB standards. And for those unfamiliar with those standards in the audience, they're really providing a unique opportunity to bring this consistency around sustainability financial disclosures by corporates. So hopefully, if we all work together around the globe, we can actually enable that more consistent disclosure amongst corporates. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Right, this is your homework now. I hope you've all been thinking about questions. So for those that have been thinking about questions, right, there's one right in the middle there. That's going to be really easy for our microphone to get to. Third row up. While the microphone gets to you, I'm going to ask a question, then we're going to come to you. So you talked a little bit about consistency on disclosures, and you have to keep your answers short here because I know I'm opening up a can of worms. We spoke earlier that the average age of literacy was like 11 years old, and yet we want more disclosures, and we want to engage with customers, and we want to be transparent. Like, are all these regulations aiming on more disclosures and standards helping or hindering? And you can have like help or hinder, and then you can add a little bit, but like don't go down the rabbit hole. Sonali, I'll come to you first.
Well, I'm a lawyer. That's a rhetoric question. Look, I think regulation can play a very important, critical role. There's, what, 4.5 trillion on average that we need annually to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So the guardrails of regulation can be quite effective, whether that be subsidies, whether that be incentives, whether that be clear disclosure standards. The challenge comes when there's lack of convergence. The challenge comes when there's fragmentation. Right? So regulation in itself, if it's smart regulation, I think it could be super useful to the industry to expedite change.
I agree, smart regulation. We need standards as investors to bring some consistency, but those standards, very important, need to focus on materiality. And that is, for me, the key thing. What is the most important thing that a company or an investor should be looking at, which is in the interests of the underlying customers or investors?
David?
Yep, so more is not always better. I think there's both the disclosures that we ask companies to make, but there are also the disclosures that we have to make, for example, under SFDR in Europe. And I do wonder about, for example, the benefits that the end investor really gets from a 730-line European ESG template, which is an enormous spreadsheet that has to be filled out every quarter. Not sure about the benefits of that.
Yulia?
At PRI, I would definitely support the regional development of regulation, because we recognize that regions differ, but we are strong advocate of convergence, and that is important. Otherwise, especially for asset owners who are global owners of capital, it becomes very difficult and challenging to operate in that environment.
So I'm going to add my own 2 cents in. I think we spend a lot of time talking about different shades of green and how green we are. When you go into the supermarket, you don't like see loads of health warnings on the carrots, right? Like, it's the cigarettes and the alcohol and the bleach. And yet, as an industry, we don't really do health warnings, right? We don't go like, oh, your pension killed 10,000 people this year. So I think perhaps if we have a little more balanced disclosure then, and start talking about some of the negative sides and not pretending they don't exist, then it would help end customers make better investment decisions. But I'm not supposed to be answering the questions. Right, to the gentleman in the middle.
Okay, thanks very much. John Holland, Glasgow University. How do fund managers discipline or sanction those teams or members of teams who are behaving hypocritically, who say on the one hand they are pursuing ESG aims, consistent with the company's aims, and at the same time underneath the surface just pursuing financial value? What's the disciplinary process? And do you have any examples of discipline? For me, this is the kind of acid test, isn't it, of whether you are actually doing something.
I think Amanda wants to answer that one, but when we come to you second.
Well, I think that touches on a point that was raised earlier around the role of the senior people in the firms in terms of championing either responsible investment or chief sustainability officers. It has to be led from the top. And if you don't have it led from the top, then it's just not going to happen. So I'm very fortunate that I have a CEO who absolutely buys into the fact that we have to have ESG integrated as a financial materiality aspect of our investment process. So he says it happens, then it's likely to happen. You wanted an example. I can talk about our equity team. They have for a very, very long time put ESG analysts into their actual investment teams. They have an ESG quality score, which is part of the official research template. This goes through our controls process. It would be used for any regulatory scrutiny, and we have to justify what the ESG quality is of everything we invest in. We have a scoring mechanism. The worst offenders, if you like, the ones with the bottom scores, actually have to be signed off if we want to hold it by the head of the desk, and that often does not happen. So there might be a financial reason why you want to be exposed to a certain risk, but if it is that much of a risk, you've got to have the real clear justification as to why you would do that. So it's about putting controls in place that actually get people's mindsets to change. The other thing we do is we run our global our Grow Sustainably Academy. So this is an investment-wide academy where we constantly give investment managers insights into sustainability trends, into new regulation, into different types of products, so that they can constantly keep up to speed with the ever-changing landscape. So we need to train and give tools to the investors as well.
David, do you want to talk about it?
So again, I think it comes, to Amanda's point, it very much comes down to leadership from the top. So you need to have support for what you're doing across the business. At Martin Currie, we don't have a separate team looking at sustainability. It's part of the role of a fund manager and analyst. So it's just, I said, I don't really understand the term ESG investing. It's really about investing. And that's kind of how we think about it. So it's part of your job description as a portfolio manager. We have controls and oversight in place, and part of my role is really that oversight role. As my background is as a portfolio manager, so I work with the other portfolio managers just to kind of understand in terms of what they're doing and that oversight. But also it's part of your job description, it's part of kind of how you're remunerated as well. And those are the kind of things you put in place to ensure that you're being consistent in terms of the behaviours that you are looking for and the outcomes you're seeking. No.
So let's ask the lawyer then. So do we see other examples from across the industry where we see sanctions being imposed on asset managers or investment consultants for greenwashing or not doing what they say they're going to do?
So there are two different questions there. So the gentleman's question, as I understand it, is internally, do you reprimand your employees for not doing enough? Whereas if you look at enforcement more broadly, that's a broader and bigger question. So if I may just comment on that, the internal conversation. sanctioning employees to do something which is not in line with how they are assessed and remunerated does not make sense. So I think that's the fundamental principle. How are you incentivized? How are you remunerated and rewarded for your job? Now, if that means in your team, in your portfolio team, ESG is a co-strand to your investment objective, absolutely, those KPIs need to be hit, and if they're not achieved, then there would be a conversation had. But if you're managing a broad-based portfolio where ESG does not form a co-strand of your objective, of your ambition, you can't really hold those portfolio managers to account because their KPIs might be financial return, their KPIs might be or reaching or indeed surpassing a mainstream index. So it really depends on what are the specific KPIs or ambitions for each team, each portfolio team, because you don't, you can easily overstep the mark and go into greenwashing territory if there's no clear alignment, if there's no red thread that runs through. What does your team aim to achieve with managing that portfolio? How have you explained that position and articulated that to your investors? And then are you actually delivering on that promise and following the processes that you say you have in place? That is really it, the clarity and consistency. Not doing enough is a different question. I think it's just the consistency and alignment with what you say you do is a fundamental principle.
Thank you, Sonali. Angus, where are you? Right, you're up there. So Brian, the guy that's just right there, and then can you come down to Craig, who's down here, who's got his hand up? There we go. Thank you.
Thanks, Casey. So Brian Henderson from Mercer. So in a former life, I was involved I was an executive that created the Global Investment Performance Standards, now CFA, it used to be AIMER. And when we put these performance, so these are the standards where an asset manager wants to talk about the past performance, they do these GIP standards. And at the time when we created them, there was a nervousness that asset managers, the word wasn't greenwashing then, but the nervousness of the asset managers might, put any old number into these track records and in a way mislead the investors. So the way we got around that was we introduced a verification process. So anybody that produced their track record is verified now. I guess there's a parallel here, and my question to the panel is, do you think that any claims, disclosures, materials should have some degree of verification attached?
Oh, who wants to go? Let's start with Yulia at the PRI. What's your view on verification?
Yeah, I can start on. So we've our signatories report back to us on an annual basis, and a few years ago we started this project of how can we actually investigate what data can be assured, and we put paper out there, and it actually, the results of this research was that not all of the data can be verified and assured, but some data can. And we actually increasingly see amongst our investors, they are going for that, first of all, the internal cross-organization verification and assurance and sign-off before they submit their responses to us. But some investors go extra mile and they go and externally assure some of their sustainability financial related disclosures. So that is possible. But I think there is more room for progress in this area.
Sonali?
Quickly add, some regulators are already considering it. So SEBI, the Indian regulator, just published earlier this month asset management related regulations, and there is a requirement for third-party assurance. There are some challenges. I mean, technically, depending on your portfolio, Amanda, David, you might be able to elaborate. It's not always easy to verify. So I think it should be on a best efforts basis.
Yeah, I would agree. The other thing we need to recognize is that sustainability and what people term as sustainable will differ for every single one of the people in this room. So with that lack of clarity that David was talking about earlier in terms of what do you mean, what are the definitions, that we have to be principles based. I think that's really important. But we are also seeing an increase in internal audits going on within the firm, so our own internal audit processes targeting individual desks or individual processes, and there is an increase to make sure that what you say you're doing on the tin, you are actually doing on the tin. So embedding this into your mainstream investment process is the core thing to do. So it's something is not standalone, to David's point. It's actually part of the investment process, and you use the same controls that you would for all of your other investment-related activities to try and capture what you're doing.
Great. David, do you want to add something? Then we're going to come to Craig.
So
Craig is halfway down.
Yeah, I think it definitely starts with internal controls, but interestingly, if we look at, for example, something like the TCFD requirements, there is a compliance statement that needs to be signed by the CIO or the CEO. So that's your CEO is going to want to have some form of internal assurance in terms of what you're saying in those TCFD reports. So I think that's a good step forward. I think there's also quite a lot of work that needs to happen in the audit industry externally, just in terms of kind of actually getting to an understanding of the standards and effectively putting those audit processes in place.
Great. Have you found him? Yes, you have. Excellent.
Craig Mackenzie, Edinburgh University, and Aberdeen as well, just. I wonder whether part of the problem with greenwashing is the initiatives, the net zero initiatives, the TCFD initiatives, the Climate Action 100+ initiatives, which give the impression that signatories are committed to quite ambitious, aggressive even actions. But the reality is that the vast majority of asset managers and asset owners who are signed up to net zero initiatives are still invested in oil and gas companies at similar scales to their investments 5 years ago. And the argument was, when these initiatives got off the ground a few years ago, that we would engage with these companies to drive change, to drive net zero commitments, and if we were unsuccessful, we would leave. The Church of England Pensions Board earlier this year has decided that they will not be successful. The oil and gas companies that made net zero commitments have partly reneged on their commitments and have backslid. So the Church of England Pension Board have divested. Will the investment companies represented on the panel be able to divest? And I know the answer. It's a very difficult thing to do. But those initiatives are still there, calling themselves net zero, pretending that they're making a significant difference to the climate. How can they do that while still allowing oil and gas investment in their portfolios?
That's such a good question. I feel like you might have to go first, Amanda, because...
Thanks, Craig.
Yeah.
Love you.
I think that's going to come back to bite you, Craig. Yeah.
Craig and I work closely together at Aberdeen, but we've also known each other since the inception of everything in the early 2000s. So we have some good, robust conversations, but we're both very much aligned, which is actually what you want to see is ultimate action. And what we need to do is get better at justifying why we're holding something from a financial basis. We also need to use our voice as an industry to work with governments, because until the governments sort out their policy landscape, it becomes really hard as an investor to make very strong investment decisions, such as I am going to come out of an entire sector altogether, when the policy landscape is not supporting a net zero transition. So that becomes really hard. The other thing is we need to work with our clients to get them to support us in our activities, which we do, but not all clients are, to be honest, want to go down that route. We have to be engaged investors. I tend to agree with Craig that some of these initiatives have become bandwagons that people have jumped on and ticked a box. We need to make sure that we as investors have robust conversations with the companies that we're having, and we do call them out when they're not making the progress we want them to make. So setting those targets, monitoring your engagements, which do take time. It's not something that happens overnight. Making sure that there is a very firm escalation process, and being brave enough to hold them to account publicly, I think is absolutely something that we can do.
I'm going to pick on this a little bit more. So for the net zero alliances, for those of you that have seen the headlines, you may not have read behind the headline, and there's this really big caveat with all of the alliances that says achieving our net zero target is contingent upon the governments of the world doing things to put us on a trajectory to net zero. It doesn't really matter whether you're Aberdeen or BlackRock or anybody else. If you've signed up to this initiative, this is the kind of get out clause that exists. And I think it gets to the heart of the greenwashing question. When we talk to end customers and real people in the real world, and you go, oh, you're a net zero investor, that must mean you're investing to change the world. And is it the job of investment management to change the world? Are we meant to invest for the world we want, or are we meant to invest for the world as it is today and navigate that landscape? And I think that kind of gets to the heart of it. Amanda, you missed out on that bit. You can come back on it, but I'm going to ask David first. What are we supposed to be doing here? Are we supposed to be changing the world, or navigating and investing for the world as it is today?
So I think if we think of the initiatives that are in place, they are not a substitute for policy action. No. They need to be accompanied by policy action, and as investors, then and as a public, we have a role to encourage that policy action, and within that framework, we work with companies to effectively allocate their capital in the most effective way to align with that or be ready for that. So, for example, if we think about things like, again, something like TCFD, it's asking for scenario analysis. So, what would your business look like under different scenarios? And it's not making a forecast, but it's asking about how ready your business is under the different scenarios. And that's kind of the framing, I think, for what we need to do. But also again, something like the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, it is also respectful of the fact that it's not our money, it's clients' money. So they need to effectively set out what they want, and our duty as fiduciaries is to run the money in the way that they wish.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end on that thought of it's their money, we need to run it as they wish. I think there are still some really big questions around greenwashing, the role of the investment sector, and are we investing to create a world worth living in, or are we trying to navigate an increasingly choppy and disconnected world as we transition slowly. I'd like to thank you, all of the panelists, for being on stage and being so open and candid with the audience today.